Okay, so for this first section, let's prep all our assets so we can use them in a full like landscape image later. So to start, um, I'll usually establish like a ground plane and stuff so that we can like set something up with our scatter systems. So to start, let's grab our plane, and I'll usually make it about like add 1,000 to each side just so we can get like some sort of size. We'll adjust our scatters and stuff to be this size, and then adjust the scale of the objects in their scatters to be more or less around the size of our scale dummy. So with ground, I don't really like working on a flat plane, as I feel that really hinders the ability to like dial in your assets, especially with like shadows. Like you won't get like any nice like sort of like shadowed areas and stuff. So to do that, let's increase our width segments and height segments to 200 so that you can see we have like a lot of topology now. So when we add in our displacer object here, let's put it underneath. Let's bring the height up to like 100 or so. We can always like adjust that after. In the shading, let's add in a noise. And you can see by default, it's way too sort of like tiled, I guess. So let's go in here. Let's bring this up so we can see everything. For the noise, I like using to sort of create like my little procedural landscapes and stuff. I'll usually go for like a blistered turbulence or the Naki. But for this one, I'm just going to use the blistered turbulence. So let's tile it less. So on the global scale, let's try 1,000. That still seems too much for me. Let's try 5,000. So you can see like right away we're starting to get a little bit more of like a natural looking sort of like field here. And we can increase the octaves a bit. You can see how like we get more and more noise going on. Then we can like play with this seed until we find something that is a little bit more like interesting to look at. And that will provide like a nice little like valley and stuff to use to like get like some good shadow and light variation. Something like that might be fine. Let's play with these a bit. Nope. So I'm going to do is increase the contrast a bit, but then let's go into our height. Let's flatten it out a bit. Something like that will be fine for now. We can always like play with it later, even with our scatter set up on it. So now I'm just going to go back into the shading mode because we don't really need that anymore. So with this like smaller displacement too, it really helps break up the tiling effect of our textures. That way you'll like tile across it. So for like all my tileable materials and stuff, I'll usually go to real displacement textures, as I find this site has the best sort of photo scan textures basically on the market. Like in my opinion, they're like leaps and bounds better quality than say like Megascan's market. Just because I know that Megascans uses a little bit more of like automated process, whereas these guys do like they actually take the time to like dial in like each asset. So like as you can see here, this is like a whole bunch of like different materials sort of like blended together, but they all look super crisp with their detail and stuff. And I like using these a lot better because like their displacement is just so much more balanced, and like the detail is there, even though you're like using like the 2K maps, like the 4K maps, they're still nice and crisp and don't have like that muddy sort of like soft forms that a lot of the older Megascans has. So for that I have actually like downloaded like a whole bunch, and so I have like a big collection of them. And when you download them, they usually come in like a little pack here, and you'll have like all your like different Cinema 4D for like Arnold, Octane, V-Ray. They now have some for the Substance Alchemist and stuff too. And so when I download these, instead of having to go into each sort of material and like find like, okay, so this is like the bark and it looks like that, I'll usually like duplicate like the little catalog image and just paste it out here inside my folder so that I can just like quickly like click through them and like see if or to find like whichever one I want to use in my scene. So you can see like all the different variations and stuff there are. So for this ground, I'm going to probably use this Soil 14. You guys can use like whichever ones you want. You can like download them from Megascans or like Texture Haven or whichever ones. I'm going to use mostly these things throughout the tutorial. But yeah, for you guys can definitely follow along with the other ones. So actually, let me bring this back here. Let's lower it. So let's create our Octane material here. Apply it to our ground. So for how I like to set stuff up, let's go to our Soil 14. I don't really like using like the pre-built ones, as I don't use a lot of the things that are in it. I like to like build my own and like optimize it in a way that works for me. So I'll be sort of showing you guys how I go about doing that. So what I'll be grabbing is all the 4K stuff, because for the types of illustration that we'll be doing, we don't really need the 8K. Like we won't be going like super close up to it. It's just we need like the information from it, not necessarily like the super fine detail that we won't have in the 4K. So I'll grab the 4K color, depth, let's grab the high gloss and the roughness. I'll just move that to the side. And in our node editor here, let's drag and drop those 4 in there. Let's change this material so it's a glossy material. And let's attach our high gloss to our spec, our color into our diffuse, roughness into roughness. And let's add a displacement, and I'll pop up this node so we can attach the displacement to that. So with the black and white images, we'll actually save a lot of VRAM if we change their type to float, and this turns it from like a 3 vector value to like a 1 vector value, which is like way less on the VRAM to calculate and stuff. And I've noticed like when I changed went through like all my materials and changed all these to float, I had actually saved like a couple gigs of VRAM, so it's like significant like memory like savings when you do that. So now we have our material sort of set up. Actually, let's change our displacement to 4K for now. I'll just lower that. We don't need that guy. So let's turn on Octane, and I'll just dock it on the side here so we can sort of like see. Let's turn it on, and you can see now we got like our ground plane, but it looks like crap still because we don't really have a proper light, and we need to adjust our displacement and the tiling. So let's bring in a light. I'll use the Octane Daylight because then all you guys will have it and you'll be able to sort of little bit better follow along. I'm just gonna rotate it down a bit to get like some good lighting going on here. Rotate it a little bit like that. That should be fine. Something like that. Okay. So let's go back to our node editor here. And with the displacement, let's start to increase it a little bit. So you can see now how like nice and crisp like the details are for these scenes. So let's go to our Octane settings. And for doing these like realistic landscapes and stuff, it's a lot better to do them in path tracing, because then you get like proper global illumination bounces, and like the light like shines through like all our like grass and stuff a lot better. So for the settings, let's just change it to 124 for now for the mech samples. The diffuse depth, I'll usually keep it at 4. Sometimes I'll put up to 6 if it doesn't like feel right, but that's just more like it doesn't really do anything visible from what I can see. I don't know, it's just like a little like buffer I like to have. But for spec depth, I'll usually bring that down to 8. All this stuff I'll leave by default. For the global illumination clamp, I'll usually bring that down to 10, and this will actually save a lot of render time, as after it hits 10 bounces, it stops sort of calculating this, and after 10 bounces, you won't really see anything visual, but it's still calculating up to like 100,000 or whatever that default number was. So that'll save like a lot of time for when you're like rendering out like 1,000+ samples or whatever. Oops. I'll also turn on adaptive sampling, and this sort of helps with the render times as well. I'll usually just like leave that as default. I find that's pretty much fine for what I like using. So now let's set up our sort of like a world scale that we will be using across like all our assets and stuff. So to do that, for my scenes, I'll actually use like this little guy I have. It's from Jama's, or I'm not sure how you say his name. I think it's like Jama or Yama. His medieval set, and because I use these guys quite a bit. So I've been adjusting all my like world scale values to sort of their scale, but I've actually like I think adjusted their scale as well as a little bit. So let's bring that into our scene. So for his scale size, I think it's actually about like 85 centimeters. So if I like make my cube 85 by like 85. Yeah, you'll see it's about like the same. So if you want your scene scale about the same as mine, sort of adjust everything to be sort of like this size. If you want to grab like a free character, you can go to like mixamo.com and just download like a random like default, one of their little default more realistic looking people. So then they're like sort of their forms are normal sized, and sort of adjust that to like the 85 centimeters. So now we have our scale dummy in here. Let's adjust our ground plane tiling to more match that. Let's turn our render back on. And let's bring this up to like 4 or something. You can see our displacement is quite heavy still. We'll adjust that as well. We just need to get something a little bit closer here. Oh, sorry, it was 14. Yeah, something like this will work pretty well. Another thing I like about the real displacement textures too is because of like the super crisp displacement map and stuff. I find I can get away with making the ground tiles and like cliff a lot less tiled than what its realistic sort of values are, which is nice, so I can get like a lot more variation in my cliffs and stuff. So for the ground, let's lower the displacement a little bit here. I'll usually end up like overdriving it a bit just because I find it just like makes it a little bit nicer for like illustrative purposes. So you get like a little bit more of a shadow and stuff like that. So now we're getting like a nice little like rocky field here. And with that displacer that we added in, you can't really see like the tiling of the ground plane at all. So now if we like go back to our displacer, we can go into the noise that we created and play with like the randomness or the seed of the noise. You can see sort of like how it's getting like tiled and stuff. This one's pretty cool. Let's just put our scale dummy down there. Something like that. Okay, so another thing I like to do in my scenes is blend multiple ground materials together, and that helps to break up the tiling even more and give a lot more variation in our scene. So to do that, let's build another Octane material. Let's open this up. Let's go into our node editor. And let's grab a little bit more of like a rocky material. So I'll go down to my little images here. And the RGs are for like rocky ground. And one I like to use a lot is this rock ground 7. So it has like a nice big like rock forms, and it just looks really good, especially with the types of sort of Canadian sort of like mountain landscapes I like to make. So I end up using this one a lot actually. So let's bring that into our scene. And the same thing, I'll bring in depth, gloss, or is it, do I want the high gloss? Yeah, let's bring the high gloss so it's got a little bit more spec variation. Roughness and the color. Let's plug those in. Oops. Make sure you change it to the glossy material. We'll add our displacement. Attach our displacement to that. Okay. So now let's duplicate our plane and attach our new material to that. And you can see like right away, we're starting to get like some rocks like showing up. So I'll go into our displacement here. Let's bring our level of detail to 4K. And let's start to increase displacement for that. Adjust our mid-level a bit. And you can see, even if you just want like a few rocks going on in your scene, we can sort of like adjust it so only like the tops of the rocks are showing here. So when I do sort of like these like layer blendings, I'll usually like end up merging our displacers together just so it's a single object. And that way I can use the sculpt tools to sort of bring out where I want these rocks and where I don't want them. So I'll usually like lower it a little bit just so I get a little bit by default, but then I'll use the grab tool and sort of bring out some here. And so you can see sort of how you can really customize where it shows up to kill any variation you're seeing in your scene. So with those rocks, I think I'll actually tile those a little bit more. Yeah, something like that. So now we got like nice medium-sized rocks here. And even like in the closer up spots, you're still getting like a decent amount of detail too. Okay, so now that we have a decent ground plane set up, now we have something to build our scatters on, and we can like dial in the textures and materials for them. So for like my grasses and stuff and plants, I'll usually end up just going to Megascans and using their sort of like 3D plants and stuff. In my sort of collection I have like stuff from like Forester and like Megascans, stuff like that. For this tutorial, I'll just be grabbing stuff from Megascans because I know that a lot of people in the community sort of use that. So first let's grab some grass. And so if you have the newest updated version of Bridge, let's go to the 3D plants here and go to grass. And I'm actually going to use this thatching grass because it's got a lot of variation in it, which is perfect for what we need. So you can like click the download button, purchase or whatever. So with the new Quixel Bridge, it has the export button instead of having to like click to navigate to the folder and then like manually drag in our materials. We can actually click this export button and it'll set up all our geo assets and set up the materials for it. We just have to make sure our export settings are set up to be how we want it, like so we want it to be like the 4K textures, JPEG, so we're not using too much more VRAM than we need, especially because it's just like some low detail grass. Our mesh export will be the FBX. And the WAD, I'll usually just keep this as default, so it just loads in like whichever one. Make sure you adjust the software you want it to send to. And so let's export this right now. You see it'll be exporting to Cinema, exported successfully. And you see now we have our grass in our scene. but there is an issue because it brought it in and attached it to a Cinema 4D material instead of an Octane one. So you can see it's not rendering properly in our viewport here. So let's actually delete all of these and delete our material here. So one step we have to do to tell Bridge to export it into here and to set up to use it for an Octane material, what we'll do is go into our render settings here and change our renderer to use Octane. And this kind of tells, like, Bridge looks here to see what renderer we're using and then set up a material based on that. So now that we have that set to Octane, let's re-export that again. It'll say it's exported successfully. And now we have all our Octane materials set up. We might have to refresh the render maybe. Yeah, there we go. So now we're getting our grass. And it's got like everything set up in it. We can go and check our material as well. It's just loading in the textures and stuff. And you can see it added in all like the proper materials and even used Octane nodes to do so, which is nicer because then we can have like use like these quick little adjustments or add in like the transform if we need to for certain assets to rotate and like move the texture. So let's pause our scene and let's properly set up our material to use transmission and still have our glossiness in it. So let's close all these windows here. Also, I noticed like there's a lot more scene lag when I have textures on in the viewport. So I'll usually go to the options here and just turn off textures. Especially when I have Octane working along beside it, I don't really need to like see the textures in this viewport because I can just see like what's going on over here. So let's just sort of organize these guys. Let's just like click on each one and just like drag them out so we can see what's going on. So I should turn on that so we can see it better. We'll need that for a sec. So you can see with this sort of like little grass pack how many variations of the grass there are. And so with grass, because we're tiling it so much, or not tiling it, we'll be scattering it with a lot of instances, like into the millions. It tends to look repetitive real fast. So having a lot of variation in your grass really helps to get rid of that sort of duplicated effect. So these like little flat ones, I don't really ever end up using those at all, especially with like the displaced ground. They usually end up getting spawned underneath everything. So I'll usually end up just deleting these guys. And that makes it a little bit easier to dial in our scatters as well, because we're not like fighting to get enough instances and not having like 5 of them show up. So we got these guys all organized now. Let's build the material for those. So the nice thing about the new Octane is they have like the composite material, and that allows us to build complex layered materials that live inside each other. So like we don't have to have like three materials down here just for like the one mixed material to like attach to our grass anymore. We can just use this composite material. So in here, let's add a material for material 1 and add a material for 2. Just move this guy to the side. So I should make this bigger. So let's attach our albedo to both our diffuse. Let's make sure the second material 2 is set to glossy, so we're getting a material with spec. Attach our normal maps in. Attach our opacity. And our roughness here. Yeah. Okay. So we don't need this guy anymore. Oops. Well, I wasn't going to use the transmission anyway, so that's fine. Let's maybe reattach roughness. So it's actually going to be our next step was to save a little bit of VRAM by just using our albedo as our transmission, because there won't be too much transmission for our grass anyways. I like to actually use a little bit less than what would be probably considered realistic, just because it gives it a little bit more shadows and stuff, which makes it helps a lot for like creating our scenes, because we're not going for realism, we're going for more like an illustrative look. So let's bring in a color correction and attach that to our transmission through our albedo there. And let's bring our brightness down to like 0.1 or so. So I'm just going to move this to the side here, and let's start up our render again. So you can see now our grass. You get a good bush here. Okay, also, I forgot to do one thing here in our material. Let's make sure we're going to material 2 and put the mask blending to like around like 0.5, so we get equal amounts of both here. Okay, so one thing we forgot to do is actually assign this material to our grass here. So let's shift click all our grass nodes here. And let's grab this Octane composite and drag it on top of this here. You can see how it'll change, and it'll actually update it to be our new composite material. So let's change the name of this to the thatched grass. Let's change this guy's name to Rocky Ground 07. And this guy will be, come on, Soil 14, I believe it was. We can actually delete this guy now. And let's focus on this one. Okay, so now you can see when I play with the brightness of our transmission, more light is able to shine through the grass. And then when I bring it down to 0, you can see like there's no real light shining through it at all. So with that being said, what I mentioned before, I usually like to keep it a little bit more subdued than what it probably should be. Let's bring it to like 0.2. Something like that. So we're still getting some light shining through, but not so much that we're killing all like the shadowed side of the grass, and it'll help just give like a lot more lighting variation to our grass in general. So now we got our sort of like default grass set up. Let's set up the scatter system for these. So for the scatter system, let's actually turn this off and let's delete entirely. Let's just move these guys to the side, and I'll usually like put them below the sort of like default like ground plane, just so when we actually start building our scene with all our materials, we don't get these things like popped up through our scene and stuff. So I'll usually end up, this will be like my water level, then everything else will be up higher. Okay, so with scatter systems, I'll usually end up breaking them up into a bunch of different ones rather than like having like all my plants inside of a single scatter. I'll usually break them up, so I'll have like one for like all our small grass, I'll have one for all our big grass, and then I'll go through and do like one for like the dandelions, one for like the reeds, and one for like our like leafy plants and stuff like that. So we're able to sort of guide where we want them to be more, instead of having them be all like evenly distributed throughout our scene. And it'll help make it look a lot more natural, because like out in nature, like you'll have like a nice like little bundle of like plants here, because that's where their seeds were able to sort of like spread to, and then like another one will be over here, another one will like be over here or something. So we'll set up our scatter systems to sort of mimic that. But to start, I'll usually set up our small grasses to more or less just cover the entire thing more or less evenly. So let's bring in a scatter system here. I think we can go to the Octane settings. No, Octane dialog, and I'll bring up like this little window here. And we can bring in an Octane scatter. Let's change the name to this to our small grass. And let's grab probably these ones. And let's drag and drop them inside that. I'm going to change my display to the quick shading so it's a little bit easier to see. Okay, so in here, let's change our distribution to surface. And in our little test scene, or for like actually in general, I'll usually put all my scatters on top of sort of like my default like soil plane here, rather than like having it on like our, this one's like our rocky ground plane, and this one will be our soil. I'll usually end up putting them on the soil just because it's where like the plants will actually grow naturally, and we don't really want them like growing where there's like more rocks than normal, like where we like brought them out with our grab tool. So let's click our scatter system and let's drop our soil onto the surface here. And you can see right away we're getting all our little scatter points. Okay, so I think what we can do, okay, so let's bring our count up quite a bit, and you can see by default it's actually going through. Actually, let's actually start our Octane Render so I can show you guys a little bit better how this is sort of acting. Let's increase it a bit. So you can see how we're getting like all these rows of the grass. we like don't want that, of course, to help get rid of this sort of like just like going through like this is grass 1, this is grass 2, this is grass 3, this is grass 4, and then like keep repeating it. To break that up, in the shader here under the vertex map, let's add a noise. And you can see by default, we're starting to get some of it broken up, but you can see a lot of it is still like grouped together. And I'll actually do my groupings through a different way. But to make these things truly random, let's go into our noise here and let's change our noise to the cell. So we get like variations of like little squares from like 0 to 1 or whatever. And let's change our global scale to be like 0.1, so it's the tiniest it can possibly be. And you can see now we're actually getting like truly random grass distributed throughout our scene here, rather than like just a one of each, the iterated. Okay. So let's go through some more of the basic setup here that I usually like to do. For the normal align, I'll usually bring it down a little bit for the grass. For our sort of overall grass, I'll still have it like go with the form of the land a little bit, but not like full. I find that just seems a little bit too unrealistic. But I still like to have like a whole bunch of it, like 65% of it or so. Let's hide that. We don't need that anymore. Normal threshold. So this is a good one for getting our grass to not grow on like the sides of the hills or like the banks that reach a certain level of steepness. And so this normal high here is like the max like steepness it will be for it to like spawn on it. So you can see now this little like hillside here, a lot of the grass has actually been removed from it. And as I like lower it, less and less grass is able to show up in that region. For my small grass, I usually like to keep it like around like 45-50, just sort of getting like some on that hillside, but we're still getting like nice amount of coverage overall. Let's actually increase our coverage quite a bit. And let's go into our display here and lower our display rate to like 0.75 or something, just so we're not getting like all these like useless sort of points in our scene. And so you can see now we're getting like nice variation of the grass. Let's actually lower this a bit. It also heavily depends on like your scene as well. So like now you can see like we're getting less grass in these sort of areas, which is nice. So now we have our sort of basic stuff set up. Let's go and make our grass varied a little bit more. So with that, let's go and actually attach a random, like a MoGraph random to our scatter, and that'll help vary like the size of it, because right now you can see it seems sort of like fairly uniform. Let's go to our MoGraph effector random. And let's click our small grass here, go to effectors, and let's drop the random on top of that. So by default, the random has position turned on. Let's actually turn that off. We'll take a second to think. There we go. And let's turn our scale on. Let's turn on uniform scale. And I usually like to give it like 30% variance. And that usually helps quite a bit. And then with the rotation, let's rotate it like 1,000, give it 1,000 degrees of variance. just so we're getting a lot of variation with like the direction of the grass. And that helps us like break it up quite a bit by like each grass instance. So now we can actually variate the scale of our grass even more. Let's go back to our distribution here, and let's go down to this scale tab here. And in here, let's change it to be uniform. And let's change our shader, or let's add a noise in our shader actually. Let me just make that usable. And you see by default, a lot of the grass is actually like almost disappeared. So this noise where, oops, where, let me contrast this, where it's black, the scale of our grass will like be 0. So essentially it's completely disappeared. Where it's white, the grass will be like full, like 100% to like this scaled number here. So with this, I usually like to do something like a wavy turbulence or like a blistered turbulence. And I'll usually have the contrast clamped up quite a bit. Let me just bring this up so we can like see sort of how we're looking here. And so with this, I'll usually bring the global scale up to like, actually, let's keep that default. So another thing with the tiling of this noise on our ground planes is it actually looks at the tiling of our UVs and our first texture node here. So to sort of get like a default ground plane for all our scenes, what I'll usually do is a double click here to create a default Cinema 4D material. And let's bring that to our soil here. And so what I'm going to do is put it on like the leftmost side so that our actual render picks up this material, but our noises will pick up this one. So now that we've added that in, you'll see that like our noise by default is actually like 4 times less, because this one is tiled by 4 and these ones are the default one. And that'll give us a much truer sort of like size for our scale of our noise, especially once we bring it into like an actual scene that we'll create. So I think that this scale is actually pretty good. But what I want to do in here is bring just more grass in general. So let's actually lower our high clip here, and you can see that's getting brighter overall. And you see now like more grass is actually showing up, but we're still getting nice areas where the grass, like where there's like no grass at all. We can like play with these, add just more sort of variation in there. And like as you like cycle through these noises, you'll see sort of like how the grass reacts with them. Like this one, you can see how it has like the sharp edges and then like a little bit of a smoother fall off. So now we're getting like this nice like sharp edge here where like the super tall grass, and then it like fades out into like the smaller grasses and stuff. But for this overall small grass, I'll usually just keep it as the blistered turbulence, just so we're getting like a nice amount of variation in size overall, and not really like any like stark contrasted areas. I'll actually bring in a little bit more grass overall, I think. And I'll do that with the high clip here, lowering that. So I feel this is pretty good overall. So you'll notice I kept the size of our grasses default. And so with that, what we can do, let me go closer to our guy here. Just sort of getting like a good sort of like size of our guy in comparison to the grass. I'll usually end up keeping my grass a little bit bigger than is what is natural, just so I don't have to add that many more instances. And because it's just for like illustrative purposes, we don't really, it is nice to have it to be like realistic scale, but we can sort of like adjust that a little bit, especially with like outdoor natural scenes where like no one's like mowed the lawn or whatever, so there won't be like any short grass, so it'll be like all this long natural grass. So if your grass seems like too big or too small for your scene, after we've done our sort of variation adjustments, what we can do is go into our scale number here and say my grass seems too small. I can go in here and add like 0.5 to it. And you see our grass will like grow overall. But I think this grass actually worked with the default of 1, so I'm going to keep it there. Okay, so just before we move along, I actually went and optimized my grass a little bit just because it was a little laggy in my scene, and I didn't really want it to be lagging out too much for like showing you guys how to do it. I ended up lowering them all from 4K to 1K, except for like the roughness I lowered like to 512 because we don't really need this too much. What actually you, if you guys want, you can keep the roughness in. What I'm going to do is actually remove it entirely, and then in the roughness here I'm just going to make it pretty rough to be sort of like almost the value this would be. So probably like around 60, 70 here. And it'll give us the same sort of look, but because you could see on our roughness map itself, let's actually bring this over here. There's not too much variance where like the actual like long grass pieces are, like actually like contrasted variance, so I'm not too worried about having this map in there. So I'm actually just going to like keep that unattached for now, and that'll actually help with like our VRAM and like speed up our rendering as well. Okay, so our next step, let's actually go and create our scatter system for our long grass. I'm just going to pause this for now. Let's move this off screen. And let's grab the rest of our grass here. We can actually use this as like a solid base for our tall grass. So I'm just going to duplicate that, open it up, and just delete all the small grasses that are in it. And let's move our tall grasses into that. Update its name, tall grass. Okay. So everything should be the same. You can see now we're getting like taller sort of instances of it. If we want to like separate it, we can like change it to be the box. I don't really like doing object in here just because it takes so long to load in our viewport, and it'll like really like bag down our scene quite a bit. So let me just get a little view here. I'll actually bring our live viewer back in. So I don't think we need any more viewport right now. And let's start a render. I'll just make it bigger because we haven't done anything. Take a second to update. And yeah, by default, it's going to be like absolute mayhem. So what we want to do for the long grass is make like nice little like pockets of the long grass showing up, so that when we overlay it on top of our small grass, it gives it nice variation, rather than like right now we're getting tall grass everywhere, and that sort of kills like the nice realism and like variance for our scenes. So with that, let's go to our distribution tab here for it. Actually, how come? Oh, okay, it's this weird little glitch there. So with tall grass in general, I usually like to keep the normal height a little bit lower. And then most of it will be through our scale here. So let's go down into our scale. And so with tall grass, what we want is a little bit more of little island pockets. So we'll make that with this noise. And so to do that, let's increase our low clip a bit here. And you can see we're starting to get a little bit more black regions. Let's just bring this up. There we go. And then what we can do is lower our brightness overall. And you can see now we're starting to get some pockets of that high grass. Right now, the seed for our high grass or tall grass and our small grass is the same. So let's give this guy some variation just so it's not growing all in the same spot. Take a second to update. And with this in general, let's increase the global scale to like 200 or so. Just so we're getting like bigger regions of tall grass, but then we're also still getting like bigger regions of where it won't be showing. That's starting to look pretty good. Let's just lower this a little bit. For now, let's turn off our small grass just so we're isolating where our tall one is growing. And you can see now we're getting nice like regions of the tall grass. And we can like play with this a little bit more. Maybe choose a different one. Maybe go with the wavy turbulence, so we're getting like the nice little sharp regions. So we're getting like nice like shadowed areas that you can see now. And then like it'll fade off. So it'll help create like realistic like little like clusters of grass. And we just play with like the seed until you get like something you want. So with the tall grass, let's actually lower our count quite a bit here. We just need the count for our small grass up quite a bit just so we can get that nice ground coverage. Now we can use this tall grass at a significantly lower count to get like the detail grass, you can say, going on in our scene. So let's turn on our small grass again. And you can see now we're getting a nice sort of like realistic feel with our grass here. Let's actually like isolate this little region, let it render out a little bit. And you can see with like the ground variation of our displacer and like the nice like regions of like the tall grass and stuff, we're getting a nice sort of like realistic looking ground, especially when we're like blending in our sort of like rockier patches. So you can see how that really creates a nice natural look in our scene. Now let's take a little pocket of like render down here. And like where it's like even like sparse and stuff, it still feels pretty natural overall. So one thing you'll notice is like even though we turned our transmission way down, we're still getting that nice like soft feel from the grass because there's so many singular blades of grass that are like bouncing the light around amongst themselves with the global illumination, and that helps sort of like, I guess you could say, like fake that sort of like transmission feel to like the grass overall, but then we're still getting like the nice like shadowed areas here. Okay, so one thing I actually noticed in our scene is I forgot to adjust our soil mid-level for the displacement. And so that's making a lot of our grass actually spawn underneath our ground because our entire ground is getting lifted up. So let's adjust our mid-level to like 0.3 or so, and you can see now a lot more of our grass is able to show through. And then we can adjust our grass material accordingly. I think all the other materials will be fairly fine just because these things are the shortest ones in our scene. Let's go into our grass shader here. And we can lower this a bit, our brightness. Then I'll push it back into being to where we want it, but our grass is actually growing to where it should be now. Okay, so the next step, or more or less what I like to do with my grass overall, is boost the saturation for it and give it a little bit more variation overall. Even though we're getting like a lot of variation with like sort of like dead and live grass, I usually like to like push that a little bit more. And so let's go about and do that. And this only really works if we're using the scatter systems or like the cloner and stuff. So that's why we set that up first before we went back into our material and added that in. So for now, let's just turn off our small grass just so we're a little bit lighter on our render. And let's dock this. Maybe that'll bring us back to there we go. Okay, so let's bring up our material and kill that. And so this is where we'll start to get a little bit more complex with our shaders rather than just plugging in our sort of default textures. So to get the variation effect, we're going to use a node called random color. If I can find it, here it is. And what this does is it assigns a random color from like white to black, like red to blue, like everything with like a float 3 value. But we'll for this, we'll only need like the white to black information. And what we'll use it in conjunction with is with like the mix node and a couple color correction nodes. Let's bring those in. And so what we'll do is tell like each random instance to either pick up like a more green grass or like a more yellow grass. And so let's plug our random color into a mount. Let's plug our color corrections into the two textures and our albedo into those. And then let's plug this guy into the three connections. And then make sure you like plugging it into your transmission like with the color correction nodes, so it's still picking up like the new colors where it's receiving and then lowering it to the correct brightness we want. Okay, so with this sort of little setup here, let's go into our color correction nodes. And for my grass in general, I usually like to have them a little bit more saturated just by default. So you can see as I bring up the saturation, it's getting a nice little like bit of a greener feel to it. Even though like with like the photo scan textures and stuff, I'm not after like something like super like realistic. I just want something that's more or less pleasing to look at. So it feels like a little bit better overall. Let's move it a little bit over here. There we go. I'm actually going to isolate this little region out. There we go. Okay. So let's go into our first color correction node, and you can see now once I like lowered the hue significantly and bring it up significantly, now we're getting like areas of like the blue and then like areas of the purple. What we're going to do is something super subtle. So like just bring it into the positives barely and bring it into the negatives just barely. And this just helps like vary up the grass a little bit more. We're getting a little, like on the red side, we're getting a little bit maybe too dark. So on like the dead side, I guess you could say, like the more yellowish, I'll bring my gamma down a little bit, which will brighten it up. And I'll also increase the saturation a little bit. And that helps us sort of create like a little bit of a brighter, a little bit of a brighter dead grass here. It's actually bringing quite a bit more saturation. Maybe not so bright. Something like that. And then over here, let's see how far to the green we can go. Oops. Turn that off. And this, let's lower a little bit. I think it's going a little bit too far into the reds. Okay, something like that looks pretty good. Yeah. Okay. So what I also like to do with my grass is like the small grass is usually like a younger grass, so I'll usually have that a little bit more green, and then our tall grass I'll have a little bit more like yellow and like sort of like dead. So to do that, let's duplicate this thatch grass. Let's change this first one to the small thatch grass. Okay. That's thinking. And let's change this one to our tall. Let's change. There we go. All right. So on our tall grass here, let's grab our 6 nodes and change it to be the tall grass. All right, so with this, we'll have to have both on just so we can like compare against each other. And then in the tall grass, let's go and instead of in the positives here, we'll more or less keep it as the default. Let's bring up the gamma or lower the gamma a bit so it's a little bit brighter. And you can see we're starting to get like little pockets. Let's bring this back. There we go. And you can see now we're starting to get pockets of like the dead grass where like our tall grass lives, and then our younger grass, our sort of small grass shader, is still nice and green. And you can see like how like nice this looks now. Let's even push this one maybe a little bit more. Not too much though. We don't want it to go too red. Yeah, so I think this looks pretty good now. Let me test it over here a bit. Oops. Maybe a little bit too red. Let's put it to 0.8 maybe. This one's 5. Yeah. And if we want, we can go into our small grass here and put it to be even less so towards the yellow. So we're still getting a little bit of the yellow, but not enough. There we go. That's looking pretty good. Yeah, I'm liking that a lot actually. Okay,